They said love was enough, that adopting a black baby into a white home would change the world. But behind the smiling photos and polished walls was a boy slowly fading. Silenced when he spoke of his roots, corrected when he embraced his culture. For 20 years, he smiled through the pain, until one day he found his voice. And when he spoke, the world finally listened. This is not just a story about race. It's a story about being seen, being erased, and choosing to exist anyway. The Whitmores were the kind of couple everyone in Willow Springs wanted to be. Charles was a high-powered attorney with salt and pepper hair, always in pressed suits and leather loafers. Elizabeth ran a successful interior design business and was the face of multiple charity galas, PTA boards, and brunch fundraisers. Together, they were the picture of upper-class America, successful, graceful, and impeccably curated. Their house sat on the corner of Oak Hill Drive, painted in soft whites and grays, surrounded by trimmed hedges and a stone pathway that wound toward a grand double-door entrance. It was the kind of place that made people believe in perfection. And to keep up that image, they decided to adopt. They already had a daughter, Grace, 9 years old, blonde curls, straight-A student, piano recitals, and writing lessons. But something was missing. Elizabeth, in particular, wanted to do more, as she often told her friends. The idea of adoption became a project. But not just any adoption. It had to be meaningful, impactful, headline-worthy. When they decided to adopt a black baby boy from an overwhelmed hospital in a low-income area of Detroit, they were applauded by their peers. "They're so progressive," one friend said. "Such a noble thing to do," said another. News outlets featured them. Local family extends love beyond color. The baby's birth name was Micah, given by his biological mother who had struggled with homelessness and addiction. But Charles and Elizabeth felt it didn't fit the new life he was going to have. They changed it to Noah Whitmore, a name they thought sounded classic, strong, and more aligned with their vision of refinement. They didn't intend to be cruel. In their eyes, they were saving him. They gave him a nursery with monogrammed bedding and plush toys. They dressed him in Ralph Lauren onesies. Family photos featured him in the center, his dark skin a stark contrast against the sea of white faces. But to the Whitmores, it was a beautiful, modern statement of love. But Noah didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a prop. From the moment he could talk, he noticed how different he was. Not just in the mirror, but in how he was treated. People asked if he was adopted at every party, every school orientation. Strangers praised Charles and Elizabeth for their generosity in raising someone like him. He was constantly reminded, subtly and explicitly, that he didn't quite belong. At home, Elizabeth was meticulous in shaping Noah into the child she wanted to present to the world. She didn't like his natural hair texture, so she'd flatten it with gels and combs until it lay like Grace's. When Noah asked why he couldn't wear his favorite hoodie to school, Elizabeth insisted on cardigans and khakis. "People will take you more seriously," she said. Charles often lectured him on how he had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good, but never acknowledged why that was even true. They praised Noah only when others were watching. In public, they referred to him as their miracle. In private, they constantly corrected him. "Don't slouch, don't talk like that, don't laugh so loud." He was too expressive, too emotional, too street. They didn't call it racism, they called it refinement. But what they really meant was, "Don't remind us that you're not like us." By the time Noah was 8, he had already learned how to shrink himself. He spoke softly in class, avoided drawing attention, and never asked about his birth family anymore. Once, he brought home a crayon drawing where he colored himself brown. Elizabeth took it and said, "Sweetheart, use the lighter color next time. This one looks too harsh." At school, things weren't easier. Noah attended a private Christian academy where he was one of only 2 black students. He was always called on during discussions about slavery or civil rights. Teachers praised him for being articulate. Other kids asked to touch his hair. He laughed it off because he didn't know what else to do. He had no one to talk to, not even at home. Especially not at home. When he was 10, something shifted inside him. He was assigned a family tree project and asked Elizabeth for help. She brushed it off, saying they'd just use the Whitmore side. When he asked about his real mother, what she looked like, where she lived, Charles said she gave him up because she wasn't fit to raise him. That was it. End of story. No photos, no names, just silence. But Noah wasn't satisfied with silence. So he started looking on his own. He read books. He searched the internet. He asked questions, quietly at first, then more openly. The more he learned about Black history, the more he realized what had been taken from him. Not just his past, but his right to understand it. He started rejecting the image they tried to mold. He stopped letting Elizabeth touch his hair. He wore hoodies again. He started writing poetry, short essays, even rap lyrics about identity, displacement, and pain. He didn't always understand the fire that was building inside him, but he knew it was real, and it was growing. At 13, he wrote in a school essay that he felt like a guest in his own family. Elizabeth read it and cried, not because she understood, but because she felt accused. Charles told him he was too sensitive. Grace ignored it completely, and that's when Noah realized something terrifying. Love without understanding is just control in disguise. The Whitmores didn't hate him, but they didn't truly love him either, not the real him. They loved the version of him that fit into their world. The one who smiled for Christmas cards, who stood still at fundraisers, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. But Noah wasn't built to stay silent forever. By the time Noah turned 15, he had perfected the art of quiet survival. In a house filled with privilege and polished silverware, he floated through life like a ghost with manners. He made his bed neatly, folded his hands at dinner, and got good grades, but none of it made him feel any more real to the people who raised him. His adoptive sister Grace thrived in that world. She was popular at school, featured in community newsletters for her piano awards and debate club victories. The Whitmores beamed with pride at her every move. But when Noah got a perfect score on a state test, Charles gave him a nod. Elizabeth mentioned it at a luncheon only as an afterthought, sandwiched between talks of Grace's college tours and vacation plans. At school, Noah was no longer just the adopted kid. He was now the Whitmore Project. A few teachers genuinely liked him. Others treated him with a cautious politeness, as if he was an exception among the stereotypes they secretly held. But he saw the patterns. He was watched more closely, questioned more often. When something went missing from a locker room, he was the first to be asked, never accused, but checked in with. Noah started to understand the silent codes that governed his existence. If he walked too confidently, he was arrogant. If he wore his hoodie up, he was troubled. If he got angry, he was dangerous. But if he kept his head down, smiled, and said nothing, then he was well-adjusted, grateful, and raised right. The Whitmores still believed they had given him everything. And maybe they had, materially. He had a car by 16, private tutors, and a bedroom bigger than some apartments. But none of it filled the void of not being seen. Not for who he really was. What haunted him most wasn't that they were cruel. It was that they were so sure they weren't. Charles once said, "We don't see color in this family." As if blindness was love. As if pretending race didn't exist made it disappear. But Noah knew better. He saw color every day. He lived in the consequences of it, in the sideways glances at grocery stores, in the people who assumed he was adopted by accident or rescued like a stray. At 15, he stopped trying to be what they wanted. He began reading Black authors, Maya Angelou, Langston Hughes, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He watched documentaries on Black history, systemic injustice, police brutality. It wasn't about hating his parents. It was about finding himself in a world that never showed him a reflection that looked back. He started attending cultural events at a nearby community center, secretly at first. It was there he met Marcus, a community leader and mentor who immediately saw the conflict in Noah. Marcus didn't lecture him, he listened. And for the first time, Noah met people who spoke like him, laughed like him, understood the emotional confusion of being Black in white spaces. He started keeping a journal. Each page became a canvas for unspoken words. He wrote about the ache of being other, the loneliness that privilege couldn't soothe, the rage that came with being muted in your own story. He wrote poems with fire and essays with bite. Some of them he submitted anonymously online. One even got shared by a major advocacy blog, and it went viral in his city. But at home, he remained invisible. Elizabeth noticed he was growing distant. "Is something wrong?" she asked one evening as she folded laundry. Noah wanted to say yes. He wanted to scream, "Everything is wrong. You don't know me. You never tried." But instead, he mumbled, "I'm fine," because saying more would open a door she had no intention of walking through. One night at dinner, Grace joked that Noah was acting ghetto lately. She said it with a laugh, like it was harmless. Charles chuckled too. Elizabeth didn't correct her. Noah froze in place. In that moment, everything fell silent. He excused himself, went upstairs and cried, not because he was hurt, but because he finally understood they would never understand. He didn't belong to them. He belonged to himself. And now he needed to find out who that self really was. At school, he started speaking up more. In history class, when a teacher skimmed over slavery in a single slide, Noah asked why. When another student repeated a racist stereotype, Noah pushed back. Not aggressively, but with undeniable truth. Some students admired him. Others whispered behind his back. But Noah no longer cared. The principal called Elizabeth one afternoon. "Your son has been very vocal lately," she said. Elizabeth took it as rebellion. "You're being difficult," she told Noah. "You're not the same sweet boy we raised." Noah replied quietly, "That boy never really existed." At 17, he applied to colleges that centered diversity and truth. He didn't tell the Whitmores right away. He didn't need their approval anymore. He needed distance. He got accepted to Howard University, one of the nation's most prestigious historically Black colleges. When he finally told them, Elizabeth was confused. "Why not somewhere better?" she asked. Charles said, "What about Yale? Or Stanford?" But Noah had already made up his mind. He wanted to be somewhere he didn't have to explain himself anymore. Somewhere he wouldn't be the adopted Black son, but just Noah. The day he left for college, they held a goodbye brunch with friends and neighbors. Elizabeth cried in front of everyone. Charles gave a short speech about how proud they were, but when Noah hugged them goodbye, his arms felt limp around them. The connection was fading. The thread was breaking. He got into the car with his suitcase, his backpack, and a folder filled with journal pages. As the driveway disappeared behind him, he looked forward, not with fear, but with purpose. For the first time in his life, he was on his way to becoming whole. Howard University wasn't just a college, it was a homecoming Noah had never expected. From the moment he stepped onto campus, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the architecture or the buzzing energy of students from every corner of the country. It was the presence of belonging. For the first time in his life, Noah was not an outsider. He didn't have to explain who he was or defend it, or shrink to make others comfortable. Here, his blackness wasn't a topic of discomfort or a silent rule to tiptoe around. It was power, it was history, it was beauty. The walls of Howard echoed with decades of resistance, pride, and excellence. Professors spoke of James Baldwin and Angela Davis not as distant icons but as personal guides. Classrooms were filled with open conversations about race, injustice, and the complicated joy of Black identity. Noah soaked it all in like water after years of thirst. His mind expanded. His voice, once trained to be small, began to stretch. Bold, unapologetic. He found himself drawn to journalism and media studies. Not the kind that reported facts, but the kind that told stories, raw, personal, and impactful. He began writing essays again, only this time under his real name. His work was bold. It dissected the illusion of colorblindness, the microaggressions that dressed themselves as compliments, and the deep wounds caused by well-meaning white families who never did the inner work. One essay, titled "Adopted but Never Accepted," detailed the quiet pain of growing up in a house where love was conditional on silence. Without naming the Whitmores directly, he laid their world bare. The piece spread fast, first on student platforms, then through national publications that picked it up. People messaged him, some to share their pain, others to say thank you. And a few, predictably, accused him of being ungrateful. Back in Willow Springs, the Whitmores were blindsided. A neighbor sent them the article with the message, "Is this about your son?" Elizabeth read it with trembling hands. Charles said it was an exaggeration. "He's twisting things to make us look bad," he muttered, pacing the living room. They never asked why he wrote it. They only asked why he would embarrass the family. But Noah wasn't concerned with embarrassment anymore. He was concerned with truth. As his college years passed, Noah's work expanded. He launched a podcast where he interviewed other Black individuals adopted into white families. The stories mirrored his own. Different cities, same wounds. One guest spoke of being forced to bleach his skin. Another had never seen a Black doctor until college. The podcast wasn't just a platform, it was therapy, for him and for everyone who listened. His name began appearing in conference schedules. He was invited to speak at panels on transracial adoption, systemic racism, and identity. His social media following grew. Suddenly, the boy who once sat quietly at dinner tables, trying not to stand out, was now standing on stages being applauded for his voice. Meanwhile, the Whitmores could no longer shield themselves with curated images. Elizabeth tried posting childhood photos of Noah with captions like, "Our hearts will always be proud." But the comments were unforgiving. People saw through the performance. One commenter wrote, "Maybe if you listened to your son instead of trying to rebrand him, you wouldn't be here." Charles, always the one to control narratives, was furious. "He's slandering us," he said. But even he knew, deep down, that the truth was too familiar to deny. They had raised a son they didn't know. A son they hadn't even tried to know. Noah, meanwhile, was working on something deeper. A documentary, titled "In Plain Sight: Growing Up Unseen," it would feature interviews with adoptees, archival footage, poetry, and a narration that told not just his story but a movement. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about truth and accountability. He sent an email to Elizabeth. It was short and respectful. I'm creating a documentary about identity and adoption. I'd like to include our experience. I'd appreciate your voice if you're willing to have an honest conversation. Elizabeth cried when she read it, not because of the opportunity, but because she feared the truth. She showed the email to Charles, who scoffed. Absolutely not. That would be suicide. They didn't respond. Noah wasn't surprised. He had learned long ago that silence was their first language. So he told the story anyway. The film premiered at an independent festival and was picked up by a major streaming platform. It stunned audiences. People who had never considered the layers of transracial adoption were suddenly confronted by it. The footage included reenactments, photos of Noah's childhood, his poetry laid over haunting piano music, and interviews that peeled back every illusion of the white savior narrative. Viewers called it brave, necessary, painful, healing. Elizabeth and Charles watched it alone one evening in their large, silent home. Grace had long moved out. Their social circle had shrunk, and the echoes of applause came from a screen where their son spoke of betrayal, not with bitterness, but with clarity. When the credits rolled, Elizabeth finally said what she hadn't in 20 years. We didn't raise him to love himself. We raised him to erase himself. Charles didn't reply. He stared at the black screen, jaw clenched, unable to escape the feeling that, for the first time in his life, he had lost a case. Noah didn't return to gloat. He didn't respond to their indirect apologies. But he continued his work, traveling, teaching, building something larger than himself. A world where kids like him wouldn't have to wait until adulthood to feel seen. He wasn't just telling a story anymore. He was changing the ending for thousands. Noah never intended to go back to Willow Springs, not out of resentment, but because his soul no longer fit in the mold he'd once been forced into. That town, with its picket fences and whitewashed praise, was a stage where he'd spent too many years pretending to be someone he wasn't. But when his documentary, In Plain Sight Growing Up Unseen, won an award for social impact storytelling, and a major television network requested an exclusive follow-up interview, back home, Noah decided it was time. It wasn't revenge, it was reckoning. He reached out again, this time with a firm tone. I'll be in Willow Springs for a filmed interview. I've been invited to speak at my former school. If you'd like to be part of this conversation, this is your chance. He didn't know if Elizabeth and Charles would respond, but they did. Elizabeth replied with a short message. We want to understand. We'll be there. When Noah pulled into his childhood driveway, the house looked the same, but something in the air had shifted. The shrubs were trimmed, the driveway polished, and the American flag still fluttered in front, but the energy was heavy. Ghosts lived here now. Ghosts of silence, of Sunday dinners where he was always a little too quiet, of birthdays where the gift was always a new rule instead of freedom. Elizabeth opened the door. She looked older, her once perfect hair thinner, her eyes more tired. She tried to smile but couldn't hold it. Charles stood behind her, arms folded, guarded as always. Noah stood tall, confident. The camera crew waited by the car, giving them space. Inside, the familiar smell of lavender candles greeted him. Nothing had changed. Even the family photos remained. Grace's graduation, Charles with a golf trophy, Elizabeth at a gala, and one photo of him, just one. A family Christmas shot from years ago where he stood off to the side, his smile tight, his eyes distant. They sat in the living room, not close, not warm, just polite. Elizabeth was the first to speak. We watched everything. Noah nodded. We didn't know it was that bad. Noah looked at her, his voice calm. It was worse than bad. It was invisible. Charles cleared his throat. We gave you a life most kids only dream of. And yet I dreamed of escape every single day, Noah replied, because a mansion without identity is still a prison. The interview began. The cameras rolled. A journalist sat between them, asking questions about Noah's experience, his film, and the years of growing up black in a white home that insisted race wasn't real. Elizabeth tried to explain. She said they'd meant well, that they thought love could be enough. But love without listening is hollow. Noah spoke not with bitterness, but with precision. He talked about being corrected every time he used African American vernacular, about being told not to play outside for fear he'd look rough, about the day Grace called him a slur and was never punished, about how every step he took away from their expectations brought him closer to freedom. Charles tried to defend their choices. We didn't know any better. We were trying to protect you. Noah looked directly into his eyes. From what? From myself? From my culture? From the parts of me you were too uncomfortable to understand? There was no shouting, no outburst, just truth. And truth carries its own weight. The footage aired 2 weeks later on national television. It wasn't just another documentary. It was a movement. Thousands reached out to share their stories. White parents raising black children emailed in tears, thanking Noah for the wake-up call. Black adoptees found language for the pain they had carried for years. The Whitmores, once respected members of a pristine community, were now the face of a greater societal reflection. Not villains, but symptoms. Of a country that has often confused assimilation with love. The backlash was quiet but sharp. Their social invitations dried up. Their charity board memberships were quietly dissolved. Their neighbors stopped waving. The local church stopped calling them to the front pew. For the first time, they felt what it was like to be misjudged by something they couldn't immediately control, their past. But Noah wasn't finished. He went on to publish a best-selling memoir, taught courses on identity and storytelling, and created a foundation for children of color in adoption systems. His face appeared on magazine covers and news specials. But he never stopped saying one thing. It's not enough to bring a black child into a white home. You must also bring black history, black truth, and black healing into that home. Years later, Elizabeth visited one of his book signings. She stood in the back, alone. When it was her turn, she walked up to the table slowly, clutching the book like it weighed her down. She handed it to Noah without saying anything. He looked up at her, calm and firm. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I see it now." Noah signed the book, closed it gently, and said, "Then keep seeing." She nodded and walked away. That was the last time they saw each other. Noah didn't need closure. He had already built something better, truth. Not everyone accepted it. Not everyone apologized. But in a world that once tried to erase him, he had carved out a place that could no longer ignore him. He had once been the adopted black child in a white house. Now, he was the voice of thousands,